Okay, so we talked today about global governance. So, by the way of some general points, it's a relatively new concept, and at least in terms of terminology, it's new, relatively new. So, we probably have it from the 1980s onwards. And part of the reason why it's new is because it's driven by forces that are relatively new, like globalization in the modern sense, transnational challenges like climate change, pandemics, and also the rise of non-state actors, which again are not exactly new, but the recognition of their role is relatively new. But the most important point is that it's a wider framework. Global governance is a wider framework for studying international cooperation than the old literature on UN and international organizations. What it means is that when people talk about international cooperation, they talked about back in the 50s or 40s, they would call the field that studies cooperation, international cooperation, as international organization. That was the name of the field. And that is now called global governance. So the reason why this shift is because the old system was pretty much structured around the United Nations and its affiliated organizations. It was very much based around, as the name implies, international organization. And the center stage of that was the UN system. So, for example, the UN, of course, the organs of the UN, starting with the General Assembly, Secretariat, Security Council, very important, Economic and Social Council, Trusteeship Council, which has now gone because it fulfilled its purpose, International Court of Justice. And then you have special organizations or specialized organizations of the UN system, international economy, and international civil society, international experts. They are also considered part of the UN system, but they serve the UN system. Then we have regional organizations and special organs. So the UN system, some of these include IMF, World Bank, GATT, and which became WTO. So all of them had a structured mandate. They were a part of the UN system, broadly speaking. And so when you talk about global governance 50 years ago, we really talked about international organization centered on the UN. The field was called international organization. Even to this day, when you talk about what's your field in international cooperation, you still have departments or journals. Actually, the top IR journal today is International Organization, IO. I mean, it's people refer to it as IO. We have a section in the International Studies Association, which is the largest network of scholars studying international relations, and it's called the International Organization section, rather than Global Governance section. So that means the focus was on formal institutions, a formal organization centered on the UN, but that has changed now. So global governance has increasingly replaced the traditional field and the name also of international organization. There are some clear differences between the old system and the new or the emerging system. The old system of international organization and the new and emerging system of global governance. The old system was centered on, again, intergovernmental organizations, as I just said, the UN and affiliated special agencies. You can call them the big multilaterals, like IMF, World Bank, GATT, WTO, UNESCO, WHO, UNICEF, Children's Fund, UNHCR, which is the High Commissioner for Refugees, WEP, the World Environmental Program, World Food Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, the whole body of interlinked international organization which comprises the UN system. That was the architecture. What was the principle? The principle was state authority and sovereignty. They were intergovernmental, very important to keep in mind. They function on the basis of sovereignty and non-intervention, which is a part of the UN Charter, written into the preamble of the UN Charter. They were hierarchical or vertical, so Security Council at the top and regional organizations had a role, but they cannot supersede the Security Council. And also the Secretariat, Security Council, General Assembly in New York have higher authority over specialized agencies. In reality, probably not. The IMF and World Bank and WHO have a lot of authority delegated to them or autonomy, but still it was a hierarchical, vertical structure, not horizontal in the sense of including other organizations, other types of networks that also helped with global governance. It was very much state-centric, very hierarchical. And another feature of that was that they were created and dominated by the United States and Western nations. So as we have looked at this in the past, the United States created this system. It was instrumental in creating the system. Of course, other countries played a role, but when these organizations were created during the war period, leading to the 1945 UN Charter Conference in San Francisco, the United States was the emerging global hegemon and had a big role in shaping the structure of the UN and its affiliated bodies, and later on, for a while, continued to dominate them. So when you talk about IMF or World Bank or especially even the WTO, the US had a very big role in that. The Security Council, of course, was different because the Security Council has 5 permanent members, including the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union and the United States are kind of on an equal basis, along with the other 3 members, France, Britain, and China. And there is a bit of equality among the great powers, the permanent members. But there is no equality between the permanent members and the non-permanent members or the rest of the UN membership. So it was hierarchical in the organizational sense, but it was also hierarchical in terms of who dominates or who dominated that system. So if you look at the system today, and again we are moving away from the term international organization to global governance, we see the system is very complex. Some people call it complex governance. Some people call it fragmentation. But generally, the idea of global governance is much broader than the old idea of international organization. So we have a variety of actors now who participate in global governance. Intergovernmental organizations are important, but they're just one of them. We have regional organizations, corporations, private foundations, non-governmental organizations, etc. So the architecture is more diffuse, less vertical, more horizontal, and fragmented. The principle today is sovereignty is still very important, but it's diluted, partly because it has to accommodate so many other actors, including non-state actors. So when people talk about cooperation today, they actually, they talk about sovereignty. The sovereignty remains important, but it's not as important as it was before. So there is a sense of a principle of transnationalism, which is a term that captures the sense of a cooperation across boundaries, across nation states, where sovereignty and territorial limit is less important than before, although it is still very important. And then there is a decentering, horizontal organization. Again, if you have other actors like regional organizations or private foundations, non-state actors. It's not just a vertical chain of command. Some of these other actors cannot be controlled by the UN Security Council or General Assembly. They operate outside the UN system, even though they may cooperate with the UN system. And I'll give you some examples of that later. And another very important development, perhaps the single most important development in deciding the future of global governance, is that there is a greater influence by emerging powers and developing countries, much more so than in the past. Countries like China or India or Brazil, or even the developing countries generally, are increasingly more influential compared to the past, when the structure and the system of international organization system or global governance system was dominated by the Western countries led by the US. So we are moving from the old model of international organization centered on big multilaterals of the UN system to a much more complex, much more fragmented, much more decentered and pluralistic architecture of cooperation. So that's why it's no longer correct to call it international organization. It's more correct to call it global governance. What are the key aspects of global governance today? We have to look at a definition first to understand where global governance, what is global governance and where it is going, how the changes are actually playing out. So this is a very inclusive definition. It's not a very simple definition, but I will propose a working definition which captures all the essential aspects of global governance. And this is coming from a book that I edited and published in 2016 called Why Govern? Rethinking Demand and Progress in Global Governance. And in that book, there is this definition which was agreed to after a consultation among all the contributors. And there are 14 chapters in that book, so there were 13 contributors, including myself. So we brainstormed and came up with this definition. So global governance is formal or informal management of cross-border issues affecting a significant proportion of the international system by states, international institutions, and non-state actors through power, functional cooperation, laws, regimes, and norms. Sounds a mouthful, and it's not going to work if you're writing a popular book on public affairs. But for academics, it actually is useful to have a definition which captures all the essential aspects of global governance, or any concept, anything that you are describing for that matter. So this definition covers formal and informal cooperation. So the formal means through governmental organizations, formal institutions with secretariats and staff and the like. Informal could be when you have a conference, a body of experts getting together without having a permanent basis to them. Cross-border issues, very important. You cannot have, global governance usually refers to cross-border flows, even though some of this can arise from within a state, and global governance does affect domestic politics of states, but often an issue that comes under the purview of global governance is cross-border or transnational. And of course, affecting a significant proportion of the international system, what it means, that phrase, is that it has to be more than just regional. The issues that are the structure of global governance and the issues that it addresses affects more than just one country or a group of countries or a sub-region or a region. Who are the actors states, international institutions, and non-state actors. That's very clear that global governance involves a multiplicity of actors. And how do these actors carry out their cooperation? There is power, capacity, both material and ideational power. Functional cooperation, meaning knowledge, expertise related to specific issue areas, like climate change, for example, or security, or poverty alleviation. Then other instruments of global governance will include laws, regimes, and norms. Laws are formal, more formal than norms, which are less formal, but still norms matter because they condition or regulate behavior of states in any given issue area. And regimes are kind of less formal types of international agreements and cooperation. For example, people often refer to law of the sea as a regime, international regime, whereas the International Court of Justice is an organization. Regimes are less formal rules and norms that still affect cooperation, shape and guide cooperation among states. So this is a very broad definition that covers different actors, including state and non-state actors, and different types of interaction, including formal and informal, and through different means, including power, laws, regimes, and norms. Some of the key aspects of global governance to keep in mind is that global governance is about managing issues that go beyond the capacity of individual states to solve. Now, this is interesting because global governance is collective. It's collective efforts to identify, understand, and address worldwide problems that go beyond the capacity of individual states to solve. This is a definition. These are the phrasing from Thomas Weiss and Ramesh Thakur in their book UN and Global Governance in 2006. So the key phrase here is that the issues that come under global governance cannot be handled or solved by a single country, no matter how powerful. So you can say that, of course, the international system is very hierarchical. Some countries are more powerful, some countries are less powerful. But no single country can address key issues of global governance, no matter how powerful. So you can say United States have been the global hegemon for a long time. But I don't think the United States by itself can solve the problem of climate change, for example, or trade, or finance. Some areas the U.S. has had at least tremendous power. In some areas, the nature of the issues is such that no single country, including the U.S., can solve it. So cooperation is not just a matter of choice. It's a matter of necessity. How do you solve climate change by one country? Even if you have the best laws on air pollution, other countries are also responsible for air pollution or depletion of the ozone layer or environmental degradation. How do you solve the problem of global finance? Of course, the United States has tremendous power in global finance. But as the global power shifts to non-Western countries, they have to be brought in. So the United States could not handle the global financial crisis in 2008. It had to rely on G20, the group of 20, to handle the global financial crisis of 2008. So, very important to keep in mind that global governance is about managing issues that cannot be resolved by any single country, no matter how powerful, or any set of individual countries. Individual countries cannot handle these issues. Another aspect of global governance is that it involves consensus forming, generating guidelines and agreements that affects national governments and international corporations. What it basically means is that it's creating consensus, creating agreement, and guidelines and agreements. Sometimes these agreements cannot be or are not enforced by collective bodies. So agreements, in a lot of cases, the implementation happens at the national level. Okay, there are very few institutions, in fact, that can implement global governance decisions. So national governments are still very important in implementing global governance. But what global governance does is forms consensus and guidelines and agreements. So it could be treaties, it could be agreements, it could be declarations. That's what it is about, rather than enforcement or implementation. Which is why often we have a lot of rules and agreements, but the implementation varies quite significantly from country to country. And in this process, and this is another aspect of global governance, the role of the state is important, state means governments. But global governance goes beyond states. It bridges territorial divides and sovereignty barriers. So just like globalization challenges the authority of the state, global governance also challenges the authority of the state, but in a sense not to, ignore states or sidestep state authority, but tries to bridge the sovereignty divide, the sovereignty barrier. In some ways, global governance remains beholden to intergovernmental cooperation, whereas globalization sometimes can defy national governments. Global governance still is very much based consensual and based on agreement among states. But global governance still, by being very inclusive and by being broad-based, by bringing in non-state actors and corporations and different stakeholders, it does create a broader framework for cooperation, which can transcend or bridge sovereignty barriers. So these are some of the key aspects of global governance. Now we come to the crucial thing. Why govern? Why we need global governance? And drawing on this book I edited, Why Govern, let me pose three rationale or logics of global governance. And surprisingly, the first one is actually strategic and can be realist. You would think that many people think global governance is a normative thing. It's a good thing. States do it because they're altruistic and they have no vested interest in this. That's not true. In fact, one of the foundations of global governance is realism or a strategic interest. So states can use institutions and cooperation to enhance their capacity, sometimes free ride, extend their influence. And this happens if you're a powerful state and you want to have more influence in the world, so you create a multilateral institution or a system of institutions that can enhance your authority and power. And just a look at the United States after World War II. So the United States was creating all these institutions like the UN system, not for altruistic reasons. It was doing that because it enhances American power, authority, and prestige. And also, the United States, in a sense, is good for US because it can enlist the support and resources of other countries to achieve the goals that it wants to achieve. So it's kind of sharing the burden, spreading the burden on a number of countries, but still the United States gets a lot of benefit. And in some cases, the system benefited the United States more than anything else. And in some cases, not in all cases. So there is a realist, strategic motive behind global governance. I mean, you might say the same thing about emerging powers like China. Is China creating new institutions purely because of altruism? I don't think so. It's doing it because it also extends Chinese power and influence. And China contributing to peacekeeping which is China is the largest contributor among the P5, permanent 5 members of the Security Council to UN peacekeeping. It's not always about, altruistic motives. Or for that matter, India or Bangladesh. I mean, India's case, sometimes participation in peacekeeping, just like China's case, can actually enhance your national power because the troops get training in combat or potential combat or actual combat operations. So global governance has a strategic motive. That's the first one. The second motive, or what I call logic of global governance, is functional. And here we can look at it from the prism of liberalism, liberal theory of international relations. So global governance happens because of the nature of the issue areas. There are some transnational problems that cannot be resolved by any single state on its own. These are, problem of the global commons. As I mentioned just now, no single state can solve them. Global governance is more efficient than national action. It's almost commonsensical to say that if you cannot address a problem by yourself, you get the help of others. So you need a structure, you need norms and principles to mobilize cooperation to address an issue that one country cannot address. So some issue areas are particularly important for this kind of cooperation. So if it is military, for example, if it is defense, you don't want to, a country doesn't have too much choice here. It has to rely primarily on national action. Unless you are so weak that you need an alliance with another power, a big power. So in security, we see that states go for self-reliance and national self-help. And if they cannot completely have self-help, they go for an alliance, like a NATO, for example, or US-Japan alliance. But in an issue like climate change, for example, transnational issue, since no single country can or should be able to deal with it or cope with it on its own, the nature of the climate change, because it is caused by multiple factors. Some countries are more responsible than others for the degradation of the environment, but all countries contribute to this pollution or environmental degradation, and no single country can address this problem. So the very nature of the issue area, climate change, calls for cooperation. Similarly, the very nature of strategic issues is such that oftentimes national action, self-help is preferable because you don't trust other countries to help you when it comes to issues of military security or a strategic threat. But in the case of climate change, in the case of pandemics like disease, you have pretty much no choice. This, like if you have a disease that is like a pandemic that crosses national boundaries, you pretty much have to call in international cooperation. You cannot shut your country to any outside traffic. Some countries might do that, but usually viruses have a way of operating across boundaries, just as air pollution and other forms of environmental degradation does. So some issue areas are really of such a nature that global governance is the only way to deal with them. And we call them transnational issues. These issues may arise from within the boundary of one country, but they spread across multiple jurisdictions, across boundaries, national boundaries and regional boundaries, and they demand collective action. So apart from the strategic and functional logics, we have also normative, a third logic of cooperation, global governance. And that's normative. And here we can look at it from the lens of constructivism. So since we don't have a world government, there is no we are still operating under an anarchic international system, so to speak, no world police or world state. global governance becomes essential to world peace and common prosperity. Well, global governance is the best we can hope for. So many people think of global governance in terms of governance without government. So you can still address an issue, but without having a government. So, in fact, one of the first formulations of global governance was governance without government. An co-edited book featuring James Rogenell has this title, Governance Without Government. And that's kind of also normative in many ways. It has strategic and functional aspects. But this is where people think global governance is actually good for the world. It's not only necessary because of strategic reasons or functional reasons, because of the nature of the issue areas, but it's also good for the world, normative. That means it can, by addressing these transnational issues, providing, regulation of finance or trade, or you can actually build peace and cooperation, make the world a better place. And a lot of people think of global governance in normative terms. For example, NGOs or philanthropists who participate increasingly in global governance see this as doing good. And because we don't have a world state, and we therefore must have global governance to manage issues that affect all of us. So private philanthropic foundations like the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, they spend a lot of money on global health. And I think, of course, you can say they have an ulterior motive. They can get tax deductions because they have so much money. Then, creating an NGO, non-profit, means you can also write off a lot of taxes. But there is also a normative reason. I mean, you cannot be too cynical about it. A lot of philanthropists actually have normative reasons. A lot of states also have normative reasons for participating in global governance, because they think it's a good thing to do, but not all. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that the global governance can be driven by all these three logics, and sometimes all three can be present behind a particular initiative of global governance of a particular issue area. But in some cases, there is more of one and less of one. So I think when it comes to security, you probably find strategic logic is very important. When it comes to things like climate change, the functional logic is more important. But in all of this, including peace operations, including climate change, including global health, there is always a normative consideration. Why this is important is because, for example, when countries may lose their normative interest in global governance. Let's, for example, think of Donald Trump today. Most people think, well, I should not claim to speak for most people, but at least a lot of people tend to think he has no morality, international morality. I mean, he's basically doing things for his own ego. And he has cut back U.S. funding for the UN. He has criticized the UN, and he has even criticized NATO, and he has taken a very hard line against the European Union. So he's done all these things. So therefore, we're going to see the disappearance of global governance, because the big leader of the most important country in global governance so far is normatively predisposed against global governance, normatively speaking. But does it mean global governance will disappear? Because there are other reasons, strategic reasons, and there are functional reasons. So the United States cannot address all the problems by itself. And sooner or later, Mr. Trump will find that the U.S. cannot really solve problems, and it will come back and hurt the United States, like trade tariffs, for example. How long it takes him to find that out, but a lot of, that may still create a lot of damage before he realizes that, but a lot of Americans are already concerned about that. So Congress just passed a non-binding resolution, basically taking a stand against trade tariffs that are being imposed by Trump. And so this is a big test of this why govern framework that I'm talking about from my edited book. The book basically argues that because global governance rests on multiple logics, not a single logic, therefore, if one of the logics or one of the regions become less important, it doesn't mean global governance disappears because the other logics are there. So if you don't like to do global governance for moral reasons, you still have to do it for functional reasons or strategic reasons. Or if you don't think you need global governance for strategic reasons, you still do it for normative reasons. And also it varies among the actors. The states, like the United States of America, is not just a single entity. So you have the American president doesn't like global governance. But hey, American corporations like, or American states, meaning states within the United States, they like global governance. Corporations don't like global governance. So a classic example of that is the Paris Climate Agreement. When Trump pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, many people expected that, this is the end of it, while at least Trump supporter would have expected it. But American states like California or New York basically reaffirmed their commitment at the state level to Paris Climate Agreement. And American corporations affirmed their support for the Paris Climate Agreement. Not the oil companies at all, but many other corporations, big corporations, like technological giants, and you can get a list of them who the companies were. But American corporations, civil society groups, and states and cities, they affirmed their commitment to the Paris Agreement and wanted to and said they will abide by it to the extent it is possible. So the logic of global governance is based on both different types of rationale, but also among different types of actors. So it's very difficult to sort of say that because the leader of the federal leader, national leader of a country doesn't want global governance means it's going to disappear. Because there are other actors involved and there are other logics involved. And this is a big test of this argument I'm proposing now, or making now, is now under big test. This is being tested as we speak because of Trump. So we will see if Trump can kill off global governance because he's against it. Or other actors will neutralize or counter him, and including American corporations, American states, American civil society, and also even the American federal government under Trump will come to global governance on certain issues because it is absolutely necessary for strategic or functional reasons. If not, it is normatively predisposed to like global governance. So that is a very, very important point, and which is a claim that is being tested right now. Okay. Now we move to looking at what is happening to global governance in terms of what some people call fragmentation. Now, as I said just earlier, at the beginning of this lecture, global governance is more complex now. And it involves multiple actors. So when you say who governs, as opposed to why govern, the book I edited is why govern, but who governs? The answer to that question no longer is international organization or intergovernmental organizations. It includes non-state actors, private authority, a combination of all of the above. Multi-stakeholder global governance, we call it. And also at the same time, global governance is not only at the global level. It can also happen at the regional level. like the European Union plays a very important role. So when we talk about the changing architecture of global governance, the term that has become quite salient is called fragmentation. Some people use it in a negative sense. That means that's the collapse or decay of global governance. But some people, like myself, would argue that it's actually a good thing, an inevitable thing that's happening. But let's look at the dimensions of this fragmentation. One key indicator of fragmentation is regionalism. Regional trade agreements, but regional action at all sorts of levels, over all sorts of issue areas, including climate change, including health, and the like. And of course, one of the biggest actors on this is the European Union, which is facing some sort of a crisis, but the European Union is a big actor in global governance. In fact, it's a leader when it comes to climate change governance. And the Paris Climate Agreement was in Paris partly because of interest of the French national government, but also because of the European Union support. And we have ASEAN, for example, another actor in global governance, not quite comparable to the European Union, much smaller, but still, in terms of when it comes to organizing security, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, which is led by ASEAN, engages all the major powers of the world, not just Asian countries, by the way, because the US and the European Union, in the case of ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, Russia, Australia, they all interact within ASEAN-led organizations. So ASEAN is playing a role in security, at least in Southeast Asia, but in the wider Asia-Pacific region. And that kind of that becomes a factor in global governance. We have trade agreements. Regional trade agreements are actually a very common example of fragmentation. So there's been a huge proliferation of regional free trade agreements. Some bilateral and regional, sometimes plurilateral, meaning a number of like-minded countries. Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a plurilateral agreement. It's not bilateral, it's not trilateral, it's not multilateral because it doesn't include all the countries, it's not inclusive, so we call it plurilateral. But plenty of bilateral agreements. And these things have proliferated quite dramatically in the past 30 years or so, at least since the 1990s. The number of regional trade agreements have really dramatically grown. That kind of creates concern about the global multilateral institution responsible for trade, which is the WTO. That was called the GATT, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, before. We'll come back to the point whether these regional agreements are good or bad for global governance. But the fact is that this is a fragmentation that's happening. Before we had the WTO or GATT, that basically did all the major rounds of trade negotiations to reduce tariff barriers. Now we have a whole bunch of regional trade agreements, or RTAs they're called, and that is one of the signs of global governance fragmenting. Then we have private authority. Now a good example here will be global health governance. Private authority could be philanthropic organizations and foundations. So the World Health Organization, which is basically the big multilateral responsible for global health governance, half of its budget now comes from foundations, not from states, but from foundations and NGOs and the private sector. So in 2016-17, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation contributed 14% of its budget. Now the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation supports or plays a role in global health governance in a variety of ways. One is to contribute to the WHO, but the other, I think their big role is to do it by themselves. So if you look at the foundation, Bill and Melinda, They are big actors. Their headquarters is bigger, more sophisticated than the old WHO headquarters in Geneva. You cannot think of global health without Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But there are other philanthropic organizations that also contribute to WHO's budget. So, regionalism, private authority are two of the examples of how global governance is becoming broader or fragmenting. Fragmenting here means the big multilaterals are not the only game in town. Other actors are joining and playing a role in global governance of different issues. Then you have another example, another form of fragmentation is a multi-stakeholderism, where you have a bunch of actors coming together to manage a particular issue. And there can be public and private. There can be a municipal corporation managing air pollution or waste disposal in collaboration with an NGO, which provides both technical knowledge and physical support. But one of the biggest examples of what you call multi-stakeholderism, not just a public authority like states and private corporations or foundations, but also consumers or user groups that use a particular service or product. You can find that in internet governance. That's a very clear case of multi-stakeholderism. So this is the governance structure for internet is centered around something called ICANN. ICANN stands for Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's a non-profit organization founded in 1998. Its headquarters in Los Angeles. The slogan is One World, One Internet. So its main function is to assign internet addresses, and so global IP addresses, or if you want to have an .edu or .com or .edu or .org, and now a whole variety of other assigned names, and also even the whole name of a website. You have to get it. It's basically this is the body that regulates that and approves it, and it's not run by an intergovernmental organization like the Security Council or IMF. It's a multi-stakeholder body where, initially the body was contracted its function to the U.S. Department of Commerce because it didn't have capacity, but now it is doing it on its own since 2016. So who runs this organization? Individuals, groups, organizations that have a direct or indirect interest or stake in a particular organization, including governments, businesses, research institutions, and NGOs. So if you look at this picture of the structure of ICANN, you'll find that you have internet users, you have a technical liaison group, engineering task force, governmental advisory committee, which basically is advisory non-voting, staff of ICANN, this is the bureaucracy of ICANN, regional internet registries in different regions of the world, including Africa, Asia, Latin America, and also businesses, non-commercial interest, not-for-profit operational concerns, users, individuals, people, you can participate. And there is a board of directors around it. There's an ombudsman who looks at issues of I guess if you have any checks against corruption or irregularity. So this is a classic example of multi-stakeholderism in a most important and relatively new frontier of global governance, because internet is relatively new. So issues like trade in our old issues of global governance or finance. We have IMF, we have GATT, which became WTO, we have development, World Bank. But issues like climate change, issues like internet governance are relatively new areas, and they are very challenging. We don't have a World Climate Organization, by the way. So climate change negotiations happen through a framework convention that under the auspices of UN. There's no organization, World Climate Organization. Some people are calling for such an organization. Similarly, internet, there's no World Internet Organization at the intergovernmental level. So you have what you call ICANN and multi-stakeholderism. So this is all relatively new and very different from the structure of a global governance or of international cooperation we had in the early stages of the post-Second World War period. Another example is related to forestry. The Forest Stewardship Council was founded by a group of businesses, environmentalists, and community leaders after the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. That summit failed to produce an agreement to stop deforestation. Now, deforestation is one of the biggest factors behind environmental degradation and climate change. And the 92 Earth Summit failed to produce an agreement to stop deforestation. So, other actors, including businesses, environmentalists, and community leaders, stepped in, and they created the Forest Stewardship Council. So, first FSC General Assembly was held a year after the Rio Summit in Toronto, 93, and created an open member-led organization, now operating in more than 80 countries. What does it do? It sets standards under which forests and companies are certified. It has a certification system of good forest management, which can preserve the ecosystem and prevent loss of biodiversity and generally preserve the forest cover as much as possible. So it regulates things like harvesting, milling, and the sale of timber products all along the supply chain, from raw timber to production of, furniture or use of woods for commercial purposes down the production chain, supply chain. It has over 180 million acres of forest that are certified by this FSC. It is a small percentage, but growing. And it has regulations, for example. So if you have, if you join the FSC, you become a member organization. There are certain rules that you have to abide by. That there are certain obligations you must do. So, for example, the organization, which is a member organization of our FSC, shall protect and restore natural water courses, water bodies, and riparian zones and their connectivity. So water quality has to be maintained. The member organizations shall effectively maintain the continued existence of naturally occurring native species, so native protection of native plants, and prevent loss of biological diversity. The very important concept of biodiversity has to be maintained through habitat management. The organization who is a member of FSC should manage and control hunting, fishing, trapping, and collecting. The organization shall not convert natural forest to plantations. You know how much forest is lost when companies go and buy forest land, cut off the trees and turn them into plantation. That's one of the reasons why we have so much smog or air pollution in Southeast Asia, because of plantations, like palm oil plantations in Sumatra or other places cause deforestation, and that means that those areas are more prone to, when deforestation happens, the soil gets exposed, and the soil in those areas is made of peat, coal, and when they catch fire, they burn for a long time, and that creates deforestation. Sometimes the companies set fire to forests to deforest them so that they can plant commercial crop, including palm oil, and that not only destroys the environment, the forest cover, but also creates pollution in countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and the like, and throughout Southeast Asia in that sense. So I've given you many examples of how global governance is done. It's no longer done only, if it ever was, by big multilateral corporations, but by a variety of actors in a variety of modes. So that leads to the question, this trend towards fragmentation that we see in global governance, is it good or bad? Or is it inevitable? Why is it happening? Well, if you want to have an answer for why it is happening, I think some points are very important. Some reasons are more important than others. But I think one of the main reasons is that the existing institutions, like the big multilaterals, are not able to address the issues by themselves. So, even very strong organizations have been that have existed since the 1940s onwards, like IMF. Well, it could not cope with the 1997 Asian financial crisis, or it coped with it in a way that had very negative consequences, including large-scale instability in countries like Indonesia. So, since the IMF could not really deal with that, although IMF supporters or staff may not agree with that, but it's clear that IMF either could not cope or did a bad job and got a lot of flack, rightly so. So the Asian countries created something called the Chiang Mai Initiative. It's a regional financial stability mechanism, which is a currency swap. So when a country's currency is being attacked, instead of going to the IMF, it can go to another country who is a member of this Chiang Mai Initiative. So, for example, if Thailand's currency was attacked, it can go to China for money, or Japan for money, lending to maintain its balance of payment and defend its currency, as opposed to going to IMF, because IMF support comes with conditionality. It may be too little, too late. So this is now, I believe, this Chiang Mai initiative has both a bilateral and a multilateral component. So you have bilateral swaps. The countries have agreements that they can go to other countries bilaterally. But there's a multilateral reserve, which is, I think, $120 billion, if not more. So that's quite a significant pot of money that the Asian countries now have to defend themselves against currency attacks, to prevent a repetition of the 1997 financial crisis. Another example is unfolding right before us. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was really created by China, is a Chinese initiative, but it's multilateral. It includes India, it includes Britain, and Germany, and the like. Why was it created? Some people said China created it because of strategic reasons, influence. Well, go back to the strategic logic of global governance. But really, the big factor behind the creation of AIB is because the traditional multilateral institutions were supposed to be lending money for development, or for some time they've not almost stopped, but they're giving very little money for infrastructure. So the World Bank and the ADB have really minimized or reduced their lending on infrastructure. So where would all these countries get money for infrastructure? Because Asia probably needs, trillions and trillions of dollars in infrastructure funding. So countries like, China has good infrastructure now, but countries like India, like Nepal, roads, bridges, and other infrastructure, transport systems, trains. These are necessary to maintain your economic competitiveness or even economic well-being. And the big multilaterals are not funding this. So where do you get the money? So that was one of the reasons why China created this. It was a strategic move, but it was the right move at the right time. And that's why it has resonance. There's a lot of support for this AIIB. And not just from sort of small states that look to China for bilateral aid, but countries like India are a member of it. Germany is a member of it. Britain, only the United States and Japan have stayed away from it for purely ideological, political reasons. And that is really controversial. Many people think US makes a mistake by staying out of AIIB. But irrespective of that, the fact is that the point is that AIIB happened because the existing multilateral institutions could not play the role of infrastructure development. So that's one of the main reasons why we see fragmentation of global governance. There is also other factors. Another factor is demand for more equity, more representation, more voice in existing multilateral institutions from developing countries. Now, developing countries want to have better representation, better clout, better influence. When they don't get that, they go to regional organizations or all other types of organizations or actors. So, global governance, to the extent that is dominated by a handful of countries, mainly Western, doesn't satisfy the needs and aspirations, including the demand for equity and fairness from many developing countries, which is why the existing big multilaterals may be losing their support and other types of mechanisms for global governance at the regional level or at the international level are coming up. And nobody is pulling out of the UN or big multilaterals. That happens only very rarely. I mean, Indonesia once pulled out of the UN, very, very rare. The United States pulls out of UNESCO, and that's also very rare. But still, looking for alternative organizations or parallel organizations comes about because of demand for equity and justice among developing countries. Then there are another factor that is creating fragmentation and kind of uncertainty, complexity, is the role of rising powers. New powers like emerging powers like China or India or Brazil, the BRICS. Now they, as the global power structure shifts from the West to the rest, so to speak, these emerging powers want to have more voice, more say. And they find that the existing system that was created back in the 1940s is not able to give them that role or voice. So this is why they create parallel institutions, alternative institutions. And many examples can be found. The BRICS, for example, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they created the New Development Bank as kind of a, World Bank of their own. The Contingent Reserve Arrangement, which is a kind of financial lending mechanism. And of course the AIIB, that it's not a BRICS initiative, confined to BRICS, but it still was substantially a Chinese initiative. The second largest shareholder of AIIB is actually India. Despite all the tension between China and India, India finds AIIB much more attractive than, say, Belt and Road, which India is boycotting, basically. The emerging powers or the developing countries more generally find it very anachronistic that we still have a rule where the head of IMF must always be a French, and the head of the World Bank must always be an American. It's like applying some sort of a hereditary principle or an ethnic, racial principle to multilateralism. So that's really not acceptable. Why shouldn't the head of World Bank be from China, or head of IMF be from India? There was some talk about this, but did not materialize because the big powers do not want to give up their privilege. France, despite the fact that Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was the IMF head, was disgraced in, if not the original, the first sex scandal, but later on in a different scandal in France. His successor, Christine Lagarde, is, I think, under trial for corruption. So we can have corrupt or criminal people from France who, despite their such bad examples, doesn't really prevent the next leader of IMF from being a French. There is so much talent in the world on development from the developing world, but an American has to be the president of World Bank. And one of the Americans who was president of World Bank is none other than Paul Wolfowitz, who also resigned because of some sort of a scandal involving women, and also was a neoconservative, which had who had tarnished his reputation by his as a neocon, who basically was one of the people responsible for the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. So you can have bad apples leading organizations despite the flaws in the character flaws or questionable competence, whereas there is a large talent pool in the world which can do this job, but they cannot qualify. So this is very anachronistic in the 21st century. So that's why new powers want to have, they want reform of global governance, and failing that, they want to create parallel organizations and new types of arrangements. But despite all that, it's useful to keep in mind that fragmentation is not displacing existing international institutions. We don't see, some people think, the global governance structure is collapsing and it's bad for the world. I think in most cases, these new institutions, this kind of fragmentation, including regional organizations, regional arrangements, tend to be complementary rather than competitive. They are certainly diluting authority away from the big multilaterals, the traditional global governance system, but they are not displacing them. Dilution is not displacement. They may be complementing. In the case of the Eurozone financial crisis, the European Union and the IMF worked very nicely together in addressing some of the financial issues in Europe. So if you have a crisis in the future in Asia, you will probably see that the IMF and the Chiang Mai Initiative and the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement may work together. So these institutions that are coming up, that some people call them parallel institutions, but these variety of new actors are coming up, they actually complement rather than always challenge. They do challenge to some extent, but they also complement. The Gates Foundation, for example, does a lot of its own health work, but also pays money to the WHO. So I think this is better than putting all your eggs on the basket of the traditional architecture of global governance or the big multilaterals, because it gives countries more choice and it can create more flexibility as long as the cause remains the same. So you are addressing transnational cross-border issues through collective efforts. Another point is that it's inevitable. Now, when you have a global power shift, the new emerging powers want to have their say. There's nothing you can do about it. or for that matter, NGOs. We have such a huge proliferation of non-state actors. I'm talking about good non-state actors, civil society, social movements. What are they going to do? They want a role. Sometimes they're led by very important people, including former heads of states, former heads of international organizations, people who have been in charge of big corporations. So they're creating these non-state actors or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and in a huge proliferation of NGOs in the world since the end of World War II. So they have to find a role. So simply, it's a question of democratic engagement for a large and ever-larging number of non-governmental organizations. You cannot deny them the role. In some cases, in many cases, they actually bring in expertise, they bring in resources, which the multilateral, the intergovernmental organizations lack. So, fragmentation in that sense is inevitable. And it can be beneficial. So instead of, there is a kind of a anxiety in the West that this fragmentation of global governance, the complexity of global governance, which indicates also the fragmentation of the liberal order, is a bad thing. Now, by the way, this fragmentation of global governance is linked to the changes or challenges to the liberal order. But the liberal international order was basically handiwork of the United States and few Western powers after World War II that gave United States a privileged position, or the West a privileged position. That privilege or that power was exercised mainly through the UN system. Now the UN system is no longer the only game in town. These newer multilateral institutions, newer mechanisms of global governance are not beholden to American power and purpose. They're not created by the US. The AIIB was not created by the US. ASEAN was not created by the US. So the original big multilaterals were created by the US, and they were the instruments of the liberal order. The fragmentation that is happening, the newer actors, newer mechanisms, not beholden to American power and purpose. So, therefore, that creates anxiety in the West that our authority and control over international or world order is slipping away. And they worry about it. The rest of the world doesn't worry about it. So, when I published my book, we had a big book launch in Baltimore at the margins of International Studies Association. We brought in some of the best scholars writing on global governance. Some of them are contributors, but we also brought in people like Bob Cohen, Peter Kaltenstein, and they were worried. They were not happy with my book because I was saying that it may be a good thing that we are having fragmentation, may be inevitable and creative. So Bob Cohen, whom I respect a lot, who is really the biggest name in international organization field, told me that, how can you be happy? And he raises a question. The very first one to ask questions after I made my presentation, and he made that. But that room had people from Brazil, Argentina, China, Southeast Asia. And they just jumped up and said, that's your problem. That's America's problem. It's not our problem. We don't have a problem with fragmentation. And Peter Kaltenstein, who was chairing this, said, it may be a generational thing. Maybe, our generation, which has seen World War II, is worried about fragmentation of global governance. But the younger generation probably doesn't realize it. I said, maybe generational, my response. But it's really about changes that are happening in the world. So the world is very different today than in the 1940s. So you cannot expect the institutions and the structure of the 1940s to satisfy the demands and needs of the people and the actors in the 21st century. So you have to give way. You have to accommodate these new voices, new actors, including non-Western but also non-governmental organizations from the West. But again, this has become a question of ideological battle between the West and the rest when it comes to the liberal order. So most of the anxiety about the liberal order and most of the anxiety about fragmentation comes out of the West. It is not really that big a deal when you look at it from the perspective of from the developing world or non-Western world. So, looking at the future, we know that globalization is changing. Globalization is not ending, but it's taking different form and entering a different phase. More leadership from the East or Asian countries, more South-South linkages, less conditionality, a broader agenda focusing on development infrastructure rather than trade as in the past, and more pluralistic, more diffuse in terms of values and ideas and leadership. Similarly, global governance is also changing. So we can talk about global governance 2.0 or 3.0, whatever you might say. So in keeping with the changing pattern of globalization, we're witnessing now changes in global governance structure and the emergence of global governance 2.0. So it is less US-centric than before. When multilateralism and original global governance was dominated by the US, now it is less US-centric. But that doesn't mean the US and the West are not important, but they are less influential compared to the past. So an example would be Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. As I said before, even though the US federal government withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and that will have consequences, but American states, American corporations, American cities are standing by it. So that means we also see kind of a diffusion of authority and control over global governance away from the central governments down to other levels. And many other countries in the world, by the way, almost I think every other country who signed the Paris Agreement stands by it. There was some neo-conservatives or Trump supporters had hoped that if the US withdraws, a lot of other countries will follow suit. But nobody did. Only the US withdrew. I don't know whether any other country has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Maybe one Latin American country. But anyway, you can check this. So, US authority control has lessened. So the global governance structure is less US-centric. By the way, one of the things that new research is discovering in global governance is that the role of the United States in creating global governance has been little overstated. It was important, but it was less important than people thought. Many other actors played a role in creating these institutions and structures. So, for example, Latin American countries, East European countries, the nationalist government of China, they played a very important role in the creation of Bretton Woods institutions. India also, even though India was under British rule. The law of the sea, which the United States has not signed or ratified, was really, to a large extent possible because of the leadership of Southeast Asian countries, including South Asian countries. Sri Lankan was the chair of the Law of the Sea Conference for some time, and it was concluded by a Singaporean diplomat called Tommy Koh. I had the privilege of working with Tommy Koh, and I edited his papers into a book 2 decades ago, and I know this. Southeast Asian countries, Indonesians, Filipinos played a very important role in the drafting of the law of the sea. The European Union played an important role in climate change, and things like responsibility to protect, the R2P norm was influenced strongly by African leaders and intellectuals, and also by middle powers like Canada and Australia. So the role of the US in creation of global governance that we think was so important, it was, but it was overstated. The role of non-Western countries was understated. So if you look at the global human rights regime, you'll find examples of this. The global human rights regime, we know that when you talk about human rights, we all talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was basically drafted under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. But the number 2 person in that drafting process was actually Chinese from Nationalist China. And a Lebanese, Charles Malik, played an instrumental role in drafting that Universal Declaration. So you look at many other areas. In the 1960s, after the Universal Declaration was done, we also had specific areas of human rights. Universal Declaration is a broad blueprint, but there are political and civil liberties, economic and cultural rights. Here, the post-colonial states played a very important role, because when it comes to civil and political liberties, the Western countries were rather reluctant, especially big countries like Britain and the United States, were reluctant for a covenant, because they were called covenants, because that included self-determination and decolonization, and Britain still had colonies. So they were dragging their feet, but the post-colonial states, when accused of human rights violations and cultural relativism, actually provided very strong support to political and civil liberties, the Covenant on Political and Civil Rights. If you look at the Bandung Conference of 1955, and I've written essays on this, human rights was the number 1 issue on the agenda of Bandung. Now, how many times you have heard that the West is the champion of human rights, and developing countries or third world countries are basically human rights violators? They want cultural relativism. But the very first item agenda in the Bandung Conference, political agenda, was human rights. And there was support for Universal Declaration. So there are a lot of myths about the role of the United States, the agency of the United States in creating global governance, and which overstates its role and downplays the role of developing countries. So that may now change, and the developing countries or the emerging powers, the global south, is going to play a more and more important role. Also, we could see the structure of global governance change, more informal, less influenced by the big multilateral organizations like the World Bank and WTO, and more anchored in regional or newer organizations. We'll see more emphasis on voluntary compliance rather than legalism. Now, there is a term called ASEAN Way. You might have heard about it. ASEAN Way stands for non-informal, non-legalistic, non-binding cooperation. Now, the Paris Agreement on climate change is exactly like the ASEAN Way. It is non-binding or based on voluntary compliance. It is also based on contribution of a variety of actors, including expert groups. But the informality and non-binding nature of the Paris Agreement is very important, very similar to the ASEAN Way, very different from the traditional way in which European Union makes laws. European Union is very much addicted to treaties and sort of hard law. ASEAN is more about informal and consensual and a soft law approach to cooperation. So the Paris Agreement is more ASEAN-like than the European Union-like. And that will be another emerging feature of global governance. Greater role of NGOs, like Gates Foundation, is another feature of global governance 2.0. More regionalism, not just the European Union, but also ASEAN, but also organizations like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or AIIB, they will play an important role. And no longer you can say regional organizations are sort of enemies of global governance. In fact, in many cases, they are supporters, stepping stones, and they compensate for the weaknesses or deficiencies of the global multilateral organizations. And finally, global governance 2.0 could be more influenced by the emerging powers, particularly China. Now, global governance is very popular in China these days. I've been going there for the past 2 years quite regularly, and I get invited countless times to talk about global governance. And before, it was not an issue. Now, every think tank and university has global governance programs. So, because China is looking at its role in the world and sees global governance as a very important arena for, making a contribution. Some of it is strategic to enhance Chinese clout, soft power, but some of it is also governed by need, that some issues require cooperation, and some of it is also normative. So, global governance 2.0 could be very different from global governance in the past, or international cooperation in the past. And fragmentation, complexity is a challenge, but need not spell the end of global governance. Could even make it more democratic and stronger. Because the demand for global governance is not due to one single factor, strategic or functional or normative. It could be all of the above. And if some factors decline because of the new populism and nationalism in certain countries like the United States, other factors will remain important. Other actors will also play a role. So I am cautiously optimistic about the future of global governance, but with the qualification that its nature is changing and going to change. Okay.